I'm going to give you the case. So we're sort of role-playing. Should the NBA enter China? Okay, that's a market entry problem. There are 4 key factors you need to look at when doing a market entry, when determining whether the NBA should enter China. I want to look at the customer. I want to look at the product that they're offering, the company itself, and then what competition there is. Okay? I like to first start off by looking at the customer. Okay? So I understand the NBA did this pilot program. So tell me more about that. Tell me more about who was watching. And also I'd like to know, and then second, I'd like to also ask you about who was sort of paying for advertising or if there was any advertising. And I sort of talked about all that, so I probably won't go over that. I'll just say the answer there is there were 100 million people watching. They were between the ages, this is a little bit different than earlier, they were sort of between the ages of 10 and 30, and they're basically just like Americans. So I'll keep that part simple. Great, well I understand because it's a media business, there are always 2 sides to a media business, so this is sort of a judgment thing, realizing this. Just because we got viewers doesn't mean it was profitable, right? So I'd like to know, in terms of the advertisers, who were the advertisers for this program, okay? Because it's possible there were no advertisers, right? And let's say it turns out that the advertisers were large multinational companies like Procter & Gamble who are accustomed to buying TV media, seems reasonable. What do they want? They desperately want to reach Chinese males sort of in the teen to like 30-year-old range. And they've been having difficulty reaching them because there's not a lot of media choices in China. Okay? What price are they willing to pay? It turns out the pricing is fairly attractive from an advertising standpoint, positive margins on broadcast. And how do they like to be, what's the distribution channel of preference for these large advertisers? They like working with ad agencies like the BBDOs of the world, so the mass advertising types, so they want to go through that kind of entity. Which is useful because the NBA has relationships, right, potentially with those entities. In terms of customer concentration and power, it turns out that it's actually fairly concentrated. There are only a couple of multinational companies in China, for example, that target that demographic, and after that there's a big sharp fall off. So they tend to have a fair amount of pressure, but that's evolving over, it seems like it's evolving over time. So actually, let me demo how I'd say that. I'm curious to know these multinational companies, how many of them are there, and how is that changing over time? And the interviewer might say, well, there are about 50 of them, but it's growing extremely rapidly, usually 5 new multinationals coming in every 6 months. So I would say, okay, that's interesting. So it seems like it's a little concentrated today, but that's sort of becoming less of an issue. Okay? So basically, hint, I don't have to worry about it too much. Okay? It won't be there in the future. Does that help so far? Okay. So I was trying to like practice talking to myself all day. Being the interviewer and the interviewee. So I tend to sort of sometimes skip and sort of combine the 2. Yes?
So what if you're unclear in the proposition how the company would make money from it?
Yeah.
Is it okay to ask that to flush it out? Or,
Can you give me an example?
this NBA example.
Like how they would make money?
If there were 3 ways they could make money by expanding into the Chinese market.
If the case is framed as the NBA is considering entering the Chinese market in one of 3 ways, way 1, way 2, way 3, which should they do, then you would flush it out. If it's open-ended, then you would probably be more general. Okay? And if they do give you specific ones, what I would probably do is, as I'm going through this framework, I'm thinking of if each piece of information I get favors one of the 3 or not. Okay? That's tend to how I do it. You can also sort of matrix it. If this is the 4 key areas, you splice it up, sort of option 1, 2, and 3, and sort of make notes that way. That's another way to do it. Okay, so on the summary so far, we know about the Chinese market. It looks like viewership is fairly favorable in the Chinese market. A favorable demographic is watching, based on what we determined earlier about the customer. Purchases of television TV sets is steadily increasing. There seems to be high demand for Americana, and in particular basketball. It turns out you asked some questions, it's because Michael Jordan was very popular. And so it seems like the viewers are there. Okay, so that seems favorable so far. Let me also summarize what we know about the customer from an advertising standpoint. They're largely the same kind of advertisers we deal with here in the United States. Multinational, big accounts, accustomed to television media, prefer television media, and they like working through their existing relationships, their ad agencies, which we happen to have a lot of existing relationships with. So far, I'm thinking this is a good idea, but there are other things we need to look at. Let's go ahead and let's explore competition next, okay? So in terms of media programming, I'd like to get some sense of who else is providing media in the Chinese market that would compete for the viewers I'm currently trying to serve, and also I'll come back in a second and ask about the advertisers. Okay? And the interviewer might say, well, it turns out that there's not a lot of TV programming in China. Okay? You have sort of two options. You have the Communist Party channel, and you got everything else, right? And the Communist Party channel is sort of not particularly exciting to watch. Okay? Funny story, I'm Chinese, by the way. I haven't really been to China lately, but I took my grandmother to watch a movie that was from mainland China, and it was like depressing as hell. Like, at the end, everyone dies. Okay? And I'm like, what? And so I was like afraid this would bother her. She's like, oh no, Victor, they're all like that, right? That way you go home excited that real life is better than the movies, right? So in America, you go to escape, the movies are great. In China, you go, it's like, gosh, at least I didn't die, right? It's how you control mass population, by the way. Things you learn. So competition. So there's not much competition in terms of interesting media programming. There's sort of native Chinese programming, and then there's sort of American programming. The mix, I've asked, so what's the mix? It's about 80% local, 20% overseas. Interesting. Within that, if 80% of the hours of programming produced is local, but 20% is overseas, I'm interested in terms of viewership. So sort of the equivalent of rating points. What percentage of the viewership is to local content versus overseas content? Interesting question. It turns out 80% of the viewership is on overseas content. Interesting. So my summary so far is it looks like American type media content is fairly popular in China, and it doesn't seem like there are a lot of people producing it. Okay? So far, it seems like it's favorable to the NBA that they have what the Chinese want to watch, and it's growing very quickly, and there's a sort of a vacuum of competition. Okay? So I tend to do this, sort of summarize so people know where I'm going. But of course, we haven't sort of looked at everything yet. I'd like to know in terms of media players in the Chinese market, how many are there, who's there, and what are they doing? And is it concentrated or is it fragmented? So I would say, who are the competitors in terms of media programming? It tends to be, I don't know, like sitcoms, okay? So American sitcoms, or maybe British comedy shows, whatever. And what's the market share concentration amongst those different players? Is what I would ask. The interviewer might say, well, it tends to be pretty fragmented. Everyone's got like 2% market share, okay? Okay, that's good. Let me ask, I forgot to ask earlier, when the NBA did the pilot program, what kind of share did we get of the total Chinese market on those days? We got about 50%. Interesting. So we are not only sort of providing the right category of content within our category, it sounds like we're fairly dominant when we actually sort of are on the TV set. So far, I'm liking this seems like a pretty good idea. Let's continue. Barriers to entry. So this is good because I hadn't thought of this, but it's on the framework because it's a good checklist. I'm just wondering, are there any barriers to entry to producing media content as a foreign content producer in China? Okay? And the interviewer says, actually, in fact, there is. There's like a lot of bribes, okay? And there's like a regulatory and all this, so it's not easy to get in. But okay, that's interesting. That's an interesting issue to know. That's probably why there aren't a lot of people producing it, because it's hard to get in. And then I probably would jump back up and say, now that I haven't, so this is where sort of the creativity comes in. Now that I figured this barrier to entry issue, which I wasn't aware of before, I'll probably come back to the, I'll probably come back to it temporarily. I'd come to the company thing first and say, well, when you mentioned earlier when we kicked off the interview, you talked about the pilot program. I'm curious now that I understand that the barrier to entry is an issue, how did the pilot program materialize? What did we do? What did the NBA do to get in there? Oh, it turns out they signed a part of a 10-year agreement to provide sports content programming, and this is sort of phase one. Oh, that's useful to know, so we have access, and nobody else does. Okay? I'm liking this more and more as I hear about it. Okay? Supplier concentration. So actually, we sort of talked about industry regulatory environment. Supplier concentration. I would probably, in this case, skip it, okay? Because I'm probably more concerned with customer concentration, like how many networks there are and that kind of thing. But I might do it to be complete. So I would synthesize and say, well, so far what we understand is that the Chinese market is very much interested in watching American media, and in particular in our tests, we've seen that sports content seems particularly appealing. It's grabbing share within the category of overseas media, and it's attracting the right demographic. Further, the advertisers themselves are very interested in advertising at favorable rates, and they are used to the product of advertising, and their relationships with terms of channel partners are ones we already have established. So far, this is looking really good. We're 25 minutes in the case. What usually happens, by the way, is if you start running out of time, they'll say, great, why don't we synthesize and wrap up? Just sort of abruptly. Okay? So right around then, they might say that if they want to start talking about something else. Or you keep going. Okay? Either way. If I were to wrap up, I would probably do it a little more succinctly than I just did. So that was a little more thinking out loud. If I'm told this is the case is ending, what do you recommend the MBA do given what you know? I would sort of pause for a second, organize my thoughts, and say, I think, for the example, if I had to sort of give a recommendation right then and there, I'd say I hedge. Based on initial analysis, not done yet, so in case I'm wrong, don't blame me. Based on initial analysis, I think the MBA should pursue entering the Chinese market, certainly more than they have today. My three things might be viewership demand. I'll say that out loud, so I'll tell you what I'm doing. Viewership demand, advertiser demand, and lack of competition. Okay, so favorable competitive environment. I would recommend the MBA sort of pursue going into the Chinese market for three reasons. First, the viewership seems extremely favorable for American-based programming, particularly sports programming. In fact, when we actually had the pilot program, we basically crushed everybody. Okay? Point one. Point two, there seems to be sufficient advertiser interest in the Chinese market. Rates of advertising are favorable relative to cost to produce, and the type of customer that is advertising is one we're familiar with dealing with, and in fact already have ties to. Okay? So we know the customer, we know what they want, they're the kind of customer we like, and we already know how to access them. Okay? Favorable. Third thing is the company, the competitive environment seems very favorable. We have a long-term deal to provide content to the Chinese market, and it's extremely hard to do so, and there are very few competitors who are able to do so or willing to do so, so therefore there's a competitive vacuum, particularly in sports programming. Based on these three reasons, a favorable viewership, favorable advertising market, and a lack of competition, and a huge barrier to entry, I think I would recommend to MBA that they continue to pursue a more expanded rollout program in the Chinese market, and maybe a long-term one as well. That's something I would say. Yes?
These kind of business problems, are we expected to make back of them or profitability calculations?
Are we expected to make back the envelope calculations?
Profitability. Whether this business will or not.
Yes, sometimes. If they want you to get to a number, they will give you numbers. Okay, so here's how I typically weave in. If I want to if as an interviewer I wanted the interviewee to tell me how much money the MBA is going to make in the first year, where I would insert that information would be around when they're asking about advertising rates for advertisers. I would provide a specific number. Okay. So the cost per thousand pricing rate was, I don't know, $25 CPM. So, if they give you a number, there's usually a reason. Okay? If I know there's a number, I would be inclined to ask for the cost to produce. Okay? And then I know the approximate margins. And then I'd probably go back to the profitability framework because I'm realizing, okay, the guy wants to know profitability. I go back up and do a profit analysis and look at fixed versus variable costs. How much of the cost was sort of getting the office open the first hour of that programming versus how much is sort of incremental? Is it a high fixed cost business or a low fixed cost business? We don't know that. So in that case, I'd actually, in a weird way, I'd pull back up and do that. So you can kind of see how it's meant to be flexible and fluid. And that's a good example because that certainly has happened quite a bit. Yeah. So it's important to know when interviewers give you data, usually for a reason. Okay? If they're giving you feedback, also for a reason. Okay? Sometimes you don't know what the reason is. Maybe they don't want you to go a certain direction because they don't want to talk about it. Because maybe they had to deal with it was a miserable 6 months of their life, because they had to go crunch data and had no value because it was sort of a dead end. A lot of reasons. But if they give you feedback, generally listen to it. If they're giving you numbers, your bias should be it's likely to be needed. Not always. Sometimes they give you a number that's useless just to sort of see if you can figure that out. So that sort of just tends to be how things evolve. Okay. Okay, yeah, if I were continuing on the case and I didn't have to synthesize in the middle, I would probably tackle product or company next. I'd probably do company in this case. And I would say, okay, great. So first of all, I want to understand the capabilities and the expertise of the MBA, particularly as it relates to broadcasting sports programming in overseas markets. Okay? Turns out the MBA produces content in 65 countries around the world, and they broadcast in terms of language translation in 45 different languages. Okay, so they know what they're doing. They know how to do this. Great. I'm curious to know, in terms of selling advertising space, what distribution channels does the MBA use? Turns out about 90% of the advertising space is sold through the global advertising agencies, so BBDO, Ogilvy and Mather, and so forth. So I'm thinking, great, because that's precisely the kind of distribution channel that the customers, advertisers in China want to use, and it's precisely the relationship we have. That seems to be a good fit. I'm liking it so far. Cost structure. So this is where costs would come in, right? So if I had missed that earlier, right, because I didn't ask for a specific number, this will be, if I'm going through formulaically, this is, we would remind them to ask about cost. Like cost, of course, that's important, right? Almost forgot. So the framework sort of saved me there, and say, well, I'm curious, is this, I'm looking at, I'd like to know the cost structure of operating in China. Is it a high fixed cost business or low fixed cost business? And that has implications for what kind of options you have in terms of how easy it is to produce things. Maybe it's a high fixed cost business, but as a percentage, it's a high fixed cost business, but in absolute dollars, it's actually fairly inexpensive. So out of the $2 million we spent in China, 1.8 million was fixed cost, okay, and 200,000 was variable. And but within the, okay, then we'd want to know in the context of the company overall, what percentage of our total cost base is the investment in China? It turns out our overall cost base last year was 100 million, so we spent less than 2 million in China, 2% of the budget in China. Okay, so it's small overall, we can handle it. If we didn't and we failed, we wouldn't crush us, is what I'm thinking, right? Maybe I wouldn't necessarily say all that. I might say, oh great, so it seems like it's a reasonable investment relative to the potential performance we could absorb it in case of a loss. Again, investment cost, so that sort of was we mentioned that earlier. Intangibles, this is a good one. I hadn't thought of that. I'm curious, what brands does the MBA itself own? Obviously, it's the MBA, but are there any other ones? Do they own, I don't know, if I didn't know sports, I would say, do they own the Air Jordan brand? Like, no, unfortunately, they only own the MBA brand. Great, I'm curious, jumping back to customers for a moment, does the MBA have any cachet? Is there any value to the customer? Because I hadn't thought of that earlier, so I might jump back. And usually when I'm jumping around, I tend to stay focused in each branch. If I'm jumping, I will visually say, I'm going to take a break for a second on the company because you've just mentioned something that's very interesting that's related to the customer. So I want to temporarily jump over the customer here, and I would like to ask if Chinese viewers have any affinity to the MBA brand. Okay? And then my answer might be, turns out they have a lot of affinity. So Michael Jordan paved the way for basketball, and he was always mentioned as in the NBA. So everyone knows what that is. It's synonymous with Michael Jordan. Great. So come back to the company. It looks like the value of the MBA brand is a useful asset in this particular case. Okay? So I'm continuing to like and find it favorable that entering the Chinese market would be a good idea. Okay? Financial situation. So this is a good one. What is the overall financial situation of the MBA? Is the MBA profitable? If so, by how much? And let's say the answer is, turns out the MBA is losing money. Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, how much money are they losing? Well, on revenues of 100 million, they're losing 10 million a year. And they have a cash position of 30 million. Wow, so they're sort of like heading towards a brick wall here. And then I say, wow, this could be a problem in entering the Chinese market because even though 2 million is it's a small percentage of the overall cost base, when you're losing money, it makes a much bigger difference. So I might caveat if I had to conclude now, I would say it looks like entering the Chinese market is a good idea sort of in general. There could be a timing issue, however, because of the current financial situation of the MBA and its cash position and its lack of profitability in the global markets. So while I would recommend the MBA do penetrate the Chinese market, there may be an issue in terms of when. And obviously, and exploring that would obviously probably take more time than we have today. And that would be my conclusion. Okay, and the last issue within company is the organizational structure. And I don't know if I might do this very briefly. I don't think it's that important in this case. But I want to know, are we running the Chinese division out of China, or are we doing it out of like New York? It turns out we have a small satellite office in China. We have a good team there. And then there's the model we use in general across globally is to have local offices and local people there who are advertisers other media options. So is this a commodity good or is this a differentiable good? And the answer could be multinational companies have the opportunity to buy into local Chinese programming or overseas programming, and so that's interesting. Well, what percentage of their budget are they spending on each? And so if they sort of throw out a bone in terms of there might be some interesting insight, I'll sort of dig further, even though it doesn't always sort of fit cleanly in the framework. So I might say, well, it turns out they're spending about 70% of their budget on overseas programming, 30% of the budget on local programming. Like, oh, that's interesting. Make sure I got this right. Earlier we established that 80% of the programming in terms of hours is local, but only 20% is overseas. But all the advertising dollars are going into overseas programming. Okay? That's interesting. That sort of suggests that we have a product that advertisers want. Let's identify complementary goods. Are there other things that would drive advertisers to sort of buy more advertising? And I might ask that. I would probably get a no answer. No, this is just a plain media business or something like that. I would ask about, are there substitutes? If multinational companies do not buy television advertising and couldn't buy television advertising, what would they buy as an alternative? Okay. They buy, well, it turns out, what are the other categories? Well, it turns out they buy a lot of billboard advertising, and they buy internet advertising, making it up. Okay, that's interesting. And just out of curiosity, what's the mix for? So it's triggering things I should have asked earlier, all right? Like I should have asked it in the customer side, but I forgot. But I'm still catching it in the framework. Okay? So let me step back for a second, go back to understand the advertisers again. Of the three types of advertising they buy, what's the mix between them? How much of their budget is going to TV? How much is going to internet? How much is going to billboards? It turns out, this is like an elegant case, 80% of their budget is going to television. Gosh, I'd love that. So it means even more certainty that we're offering the thing they want to spend money on. And I would probably, on this particular case, I'd probably wrap up there and say, great, I think I have a sense of what's going on here. The interview might say, particularly since we're running out of time, well, what would you suggest the MBA do? And I would basically say what I said earlier a few minutes ago, and then sort of close out that case. A couple things to note, just in general. You notice how there are certain key issues I did not instinctively remember to ask. Right? And you can sort of remember, oh, it's a good idea, forgot. And by going through the framework, it reminded me. Okay? And you notice that sometimes some of the information I provided, it was in fact very relevant. Right? And I did not sort of catch it intuitively on the first go around because it didn't have to be in that part of the framework. So the framework is just a good way to cover your bases. It's a good checklist. And the way I evolved this framework was every time I kept going to these case interview workshops, and every time there was an issue that I went after the fact that I heard the case, I went back, I checked my framework to figure out if my framework would have caught it. And a lot of times it wouldn't, and so I inserted it in there. Okay? So it's sort of like, any traders in the room? Like financial traders, they do sort of, they build models around on what things to buy and sell, and they use sort of computer programs. And what they do is they back test it. They take sort of the last 10 years data, and they figure out if the model would have predicted how much money it would have made. And so that's sort of how I did this. Things I would have missed, I went back and added it in. It's not meant to be 100% complete. It's meant to sort of be complete enough to flesh out the key issues that would then trigger me to sort of dig further. Okay? So really, the role is really sort of get you to the halfway point, and then the rest is more about sort of using the information you've learned to determine what you do next. Yes, question?
Should you use the interviewer's cue of, hey, it's time to wrap it up, what's the conclusion to cut off your analysis, or is it better to, okay, you've gone through the four things,
If they tell you to wrap up, wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, if you get to that conclusion in 10 minutes out of the 20 that you have, is that frowned upon?
Oh, yeah. Oh, well, no, I take it back. If the case is, if it's a profitability case, for example, like I've had profitability cases that, like I nail in 7 minutes, right? Because it was just, and because it was just like it was one problem, right? And it was a problem you couldn't fix. So, and then we just sort of just chatted for like 20 minutes, or maybe you gave me something else, I can't remember. But in a business situation case, there's like a lot more information you can always elicit, and if you're finishing a business situation case in 10 minutes, you're probably doing it wrong. If you're finishing a profitability case in 10 minutes and it's sort of very clear you understand the contextual issues, it's possible that's appropriate. And then if you're going too long, you got someone else waiting outside to be interviewed next, so when they say cut it off, you cut it off.
So it's not frowned upon that they cut you off. It's pretty common.
Yeah, it's fairly common. So, you know, it's like I'm watching the schedule, you got 3 minutes left, I want to give you a chance to ask 1 or 2 questions sort of about my firm. So it's fairly common, 5 minutes to go, like I'd say, great, why don't you synthesize, why don't you summarize, well, what do you think, given what you know so far to date, what do you think the MBA should do? Why don't you make a recommendation? And then you sort of would do the close. So that's sort of typically how it works. And I would say 70% of the time I was cut off. Because they're paying attention to the watch, I'm not. I'm trying to remember numbers. And they got a schedule to maintain, so 70% of the time they'll tell you, wrap it up.